You think you know Central Park. Almost everyone does. You've seen the wide green lawns like velvet laid across Manhattan's hard geometry. You've watched joggers glide past like the city has finally learned to breathe. You've seen couples picnic under trees that look as if they've always belonged there, as if nature simply happened to survive the richest and busiest island in America. And if you're like most people, you've absorbed the park as a romance, a lung of the city, a miracle of green, a democratic refuge where the noise softens and the skyline becomes a distant rumor. Now let's commit a small act of violence against that romance. Because what you are looking at is not nature. It is a performance. It is a meticulously engineered illusion, one of the largest stage sets ever built in the modern world, so convincing that the audience forgets it was constructed. Every rock that looks ancient, every lake that looks found, every hill that feels natural, every picturesque curve of path that seems to follow the land's own logic, almost all of it was arranged, placed, sculpted, forced into being. And here is the line that should change the way you see the grass beneath your feet. This paradise did not begin as a gift. It began as a crime scene, not the kind you can tape off with yellow ribbon, the kind that gets paved over with beauty until even the victim's name stops being spoken. Central Park is a masterpiece, yes, but it is also a monument to what power can do when it decides the city's future is more valuable than certain people's present. So imagine the opening shot, a drone gliding over the park, sunlight spilling across the sheet meadow, laughter rising from blankets, the skyline hovering like a dream behind the tree line. Your instinct is to exhale. Then the image snaps like a negative exposed in a dark room. The music turns, the greens drain into something colder, and the narration lowers its voice, not to be dramatic, but because the truth is heavy. There is nothing untouched about this place. The park is not preserved wilderness. It is carved terrain, a gigantic act of urban disguise. And beneath the disguise, beneath the lawns, beneath the paths, beneath layers of imported soil, lies a story. New York buried for more than a century, a thriving community, homes, churches, schools, gardens, and the fragile miracle of black land ownership in a city designed to deny it. That community had a name, Seneca Village. If that name feels unfamiliar, that is not an accident. Erasure works best when it becomes normal. The most effective crime is the one that gets rebranded as progress. In the mid-19th century, long before gentrification became a modern word people argue about on social media, New York executed one of the earliest and most influential versions of it. Remove the inconvenient poor, the inconvenient black, the inconvenient independent, then build a public good that makes everyone forget who had to disappear for it to exist. Central Park, in other words, is the city's most beautiful alibi. And like any good alibi, it depends on misdirection. The park looks like nature, so you assume it was found. The park feels public, so you assume it was democratic. The park is beloved, so you assume it was born innocent. But the truth is sharper. The park was a project of power, political power, economic power, cultural power. It was a tool to reshape Manhattan's identity at a moment when the city was exploding with immigration, congestion, disease fears, and class tension. The wealthy wanted distance from the chaos. The reformers wanted order. The press wanted a story. The politicians wanted a legacy. And the people who stood on the chosen land, those who had built lives there, were treated like background noise in someone else's grand design. Here's the unsettling part. The park's beauty is not separate from its violence. The beauty was the method. The beauty made the violence feel justified. Because once you can point to a great lawn and say, look what we created, you can stop talking about what you destroyed. Once the city starts taking wedding photos on the grass, who wants to hear about the families dragged away? Once children laugh on playgrounds, who wants to remember that houses once stood there? Once art is installed, who wants to look for the graves? This is how urban myth becomes more dangerous than any ghost story. The Dakota's darkness is cinematic. Central Park's darkness is administrative. One feels eerie, the other feels necessary. But it is the second kind, quiet, bureaucratic, justified, that builds the modern world. So let's set the stakes clearly, right from the start. This episode is not about ruining Central Park. It is about seeing it. It is about holding two truths at once. The park can be magnificent, and the park can be cruel. The park can be a gift, and the park can be stolen goods. It can be democratic space, and it can be built through profoundly undemocratic acts. A masterpiece of landscape paid for with displacement. A public paradise purchased with private suffering. And we begin where any honest investigation begins, not with the polished outcome, but with the raw material. What was this land before it became the park? Why did the city choose it? What kind of engineering, and I mean literal engineering, did it require to turn swampy, rocky terrain into a seamless pastoral dream? And most importantly, who was already living there building something precious before the city decided their existence was inconvenient? In part 2, we pull the curtain back on the nature machine. You'll see Central Park not as a preserved landscape, but as a massive construction site, an earthwork project so violent, so technical, so unnatural that the word park begins to feel almost dishonest. Then, once we understand the machine, we'll return to the people that crushed Seneca Village and watch how a community can be erased not only by demolition, but by narrative, by newspapers, by labels, by the strategic use of disgust and fear. To understand Central Park, you have to stop picturing it as landscape and start picturing it as industry. Because before it became a canvas of green calm, it was an argument about what New York wanted to be and who New York was willing to sacrifice to get there. The park did not emerge the way a forest emerges. It was not protected. It was made. It was built with a mindset of a railroad, a canal, a fortress. Plan, labor, force, repeat. Its genius lies not only in its beauty, but in how thoroughly it convinces you that beauty required no violence. The land that would become Central Park was not a pristine Eden. It was uneven, rocky, swampy in places, and in the mid-19th century, it was dotted with settlements, small communities, farms, shanties, gardens, churches. It was messy land, lived-in land. And it sat at precisely the moment Manhattan was becoming unbearable to the people who had power. The city below was crowding, thickening, sweating. Tenements packed tighter. Streets carried the smells of animals, waste, industry. Disease fears spread through rumor and reality alike. The richer classes did what they always do when a city begins to feel too close. They looked for distance. And when distance was not available, they manufactured it. That is the first truth. Central Park is not simply a park. It is a pressure valve for an overcrowded metropolis, and pressure valves are never neutral. They are built for someone's relief. The second truth is even more unsettling. Central Park's natural look is the product of extreme manipulation. What you experience is effortless rolling lawns, gentle hills, lakes that look like they were always waiting, was engineered through a scale of earth moving that belongs to the world of megaprojects. The city reshaped the terrain as if it were sculpting a continent in miniature. They cut through rock. They drained and redirected water. They graded slopes. They imported soil. They planted trees and shrubs in the tens, then hundreds of thousands, arranging vegetation like brushstrokes in a painting designed to read as wild. The wilderness aesthetic was, in practice, an act of design discipline so strict it bordered on obsession. And then comes the detail that hits like a slap, because it exposes the park as an act of violent craftsmanship. The blasting. The rock beneath Manhattan does not politely yield. It is ancient, stubborn, and expensive to move. So they did what the 19th century did best. They used explosives, gunpowder, controlled detonations, repeated blasts that turned stubborn geology into rubble that could be removed, reshaped, or buried beneath new layers. When you stand in Central Park today and admire the natural outcrops, you are often looking at a carefully selected survival of what was not convenient to remove, framed, emphasized, made scenic. The rest was fractured into submission. It's hard to keep this in mind while watching someone throw a frisbee. That's the point. The illusion depends on forgetting the labor. So picture the park not as an open lawn, but as a battlefield of logistics. Thousands of workers, wagons and carts in constant motion, stone hauled, soil shifted, drainage systems dug, roads rerouted. Think of the noise, the metallic rhythm of tools, the shouts, the cracking report of blasts, echoing off a city still half under construction. Think of the dust, the mud, the sweat. Think of how nature would have looked during those years. Not poetic, but torn open. And then, because the park is so successful as a deception, you have to ask, why go to such extremes? Why not a smaller park? Why not a simpler garden? Why build a massive pastoral theater in the middle of Manhattan? This is where Central Park reveals its double purpose, and the double purpose is the moral problem. The designers Frederick Law Olmsted and Calvert Vaux imagined the park as something close to democratic medicine, a place where all classes could breathe the same air, walk the same paths, share a common civic beauty. In their language, the park was a moral project. It would soften the city's harshness. It would calm social tensions. It would be a public good, a shared sanctuary that could improve both mind and body. But ideals need funding, and funding comes with conditions. The elite, especially the property owners who understood that a magnificent park would raise surrounding real estate values, wanted something else. They wanted a stage, a controlled environment where wealth could perform itself under the respectable cover of public culture. In the 19th century, conspicuous consumption didn't always look like flashing luxury brands. It looked like carriage processions. It looked like promenading. It looked like being seen at leisure in a landscape designed to frame your clothing, your manners, your horses, your time. The park became a way to separate the right kind of public from the wrong kind, to replace the chaotic street with a curated street, to replace the unpredictable crowd with an audience that knew the rules. So the park was born as a compromise that contained a contradiction. It would be democratic in theory, but socially coded in practice. Open to all, but designed around the tastes of the few. A public space shaped by private interests. And once you see that, the engineering takes on a darker meaning. The park wasn't only an aesthetic transformation. It was a social instrument. By making a large, desirable green space in the center of the island, New York created a magnet for wealth. Neighborhoods near the park would become more valuable, more respectable, more exclusive over time. The park, in effect, was an engine for remaking Manhattan's class geography. It nudged the city's center of gravity toward the tastes of the powerful. It taught the island where beauty lived, and beauty, in the language of urban development, often means expensive. And, but there is still one more layer, because none of this could happen until the land was cleared. And cleared is the cleanest verb in urban history. It sounds like tidying up. It sounds like removing clutter. It sounds like harmless improvement. In reality, it means displacing people whose lives do not fit the desired future. This is where Seneca Village enters the story, not as a footnote, but as the park's buried foundation. A community of free Black New Yorkers and other marginalized residents living, building, worshiping, educating their children on land they owned. That ownership mattered more than most people today realize. Because in that era, land ownership could mean the difference between having a voice and being erased. It could mean the right to vote. It could mean dignity. It could mean a fragile form of protection in a city designed to deny you protection. And if you are a city that wants a stage for the wealthy, a community like that is inconvenient in two ways. It occupies valuable land, and it contradicts the story the city wants to tell about itself. A free Black community owning property, forming institutions, creating stability. This does not fit the convenient narrative that the poor are poor because they are disorderly, or that Black life cannot flourish without white supervision. Seneca Village was evidence, and evidence is dangerous to power. So before the physical clearing came the narrative clearing. Before the demolitions came the smear. Because the easiest way to take something from people is to convince the public they don't deserve it. In part 3, we step directly into that crime, the erasure of Seneca Village. We'll locate it on the map, roughly where you might now spread a picnic blanket, and we'll watch how a thriving community was reframed as a slum, how the press and the state worked together to make displacement feel like progress, and how a legal mechanism, eminent domain, became the polite weapon that did the job. If Central Park is a stage, then Seneca Village was the part of the script New York wanted to erase. Not because it was insignificant, but because it was inconveniently real. It sat on valuable land. It carried a different meaning than the one the city's elite wanted to attach to this area. It was a living contradiction to the myth that only the rich can build stability, that only the powerful can create civilization. And in a century when black freedom was legally fragile and socially contested, a community of free black landowners, rooted, organized, visible, was not just a neighborhood. It was a quiet act of defiance. Seneca Village existed on the west side of what is now Central Park, roughly between 82nd and 89th Streets. If you walk there today, you will see lawns, play areas, paths, spaces designed for leisure and innocence. But if you rewind the film of the city, you would see something else. Houses, gardens, fences, church buildings, a school, the small, everyday architecture of people building a life that could last. The residents were not simply squatters. Many were property owners. That detail is crucial, because property ownership in that era was more than economics. It was citizenship in physical form. It could confer voting rights. It could confer legitimacy. It could give a person a stake. The state was forced, at least on paper, to recognize. And Seneca Village mattered because it offered something rare, a community where black New Yorkers could live with a degree of autonomy. Manhattan's downtown was crowded with poverty and hostility. Racism was not merely an attitude. It was a system that shaped where people could live, work, worship, and whether their children could safely walk the street. Seneca Village, on the city's edge at the time, functioned as a kind of refuge. It was not paradise, no real community is, but it was a place where people could breathe, build, and belong without being constantly crushed by the city's daily humiliations. That is what made it dangerous to the people designing the park. Because Central Park was not going to be built on empty land. It would be built on someone's home. The city needed the public to accept that reality, or at least to look away from it. And so the first phase of the operation was not demolition. It was storytelling. This is where the smear campaign begins, one of the oldest tricks in urban redevelopment. Label the target as blight, and removal becomes virtue. Newspapers and officials began to describe the settlements on the park's future land as shanty towns, as squalor, as disease-ridden swamps of disorder. The language was strategic. It wasn't just descriptive, it was moral. The people weren't framed as residents, they were framed as contamination. If you can convince the public that a community is filth, then clearing it becomes hygiene. If you can convince the public that a place is a slum, then destroying it becomes improvement. This is how violence puts on clean gloves. The cruelty is not only that the labels were often exaggerated or false. The cruelty is that the labels were selective. New York had overcrowded, unsanitary conditions in many places, but not every place was targeted for cleansing in the same way. Seneca Village was vulnerable not because it was uniquely unhealthy, but because its residents were politically weak compared to the forces aligned against them. Vulnerability is often mistaken for guilt. In development politics, the easiest people to move are the people society has already trained itself not to care about. And then came the legal instrument that makes everything sound respectable: eminent domain. The concept is simple and chilling. The government can take private property for public use, provided it offers compensation. In theory, this is a mechanism for building roads, bridges, infrastructure, things that benefit everyone. In practice, it can become a weapon that allows the state to decide whose private life is expendable in the name of public beauty. Here is where the episode's theme sharpens into something modern, because public use is a phrase with infinite elasticity. A park can be public use. A highway can be public use. A redevelopment project can be public use. And once you accept the logic that the state can remove people from land for the greater good, everything depends on who gets to define greater and who gets defined as less. In the 1,850 seconds, New York made its decision. The park would be built, the land would be taken, the people would be moved. Now imagine the psychology of that moment from the perspective of Seneca Village residents. Many of them had done what the city's moral rhetoric told them to do. They worked, they saved, they purchased property, they built churches, they created institutions, they rooted themselves, they made a claim to belonging. And then the city arrived with paperwork and power and told them their claim was temporary, that their stability could be overridden by a bigger story written by richer hands. This is what makes Seneca Village so painful. It's not only a story of poverty, it's a story of achievement being erased, a story of progress being reversed, a story of a community building a fragile ladder out of marginalization, only to have the ladder kicked away because the land beneath it became valuable. And the tragedy deepens when you consider what displacement means beyond moving a body. To remove a community is to remove its networks. The neighbor who watches your child, the church that anchors your week, the school that gives your children language for the future, the garden that makes a home feel permanent. Displacement is not a relocation, it is a dismantling. It scatters people into neighborhoods where the same support systems do not exist. It breaks continuity. It turns stability into a memory. This is why the park's creation qualifies as an early chapter in the story we now call gentrification. The process by which a place is made more desirable for wealth, and the people who made it livable are pushed out when desirability becomes profitable. The term is modern, but the pattern is old. And Central Park, so often framed as democratic, was built through a profoundly undemocratic decision about who had the right to remain. Now, to make the story even colder, notice how the city's narrative framed the displacement. It wasn't presented as theft. It was presented as necessity. It was framed as a civic upgrade. That is how you make the public swallow injustice. You tell them it tastes like beauty. But the operation did not end with paperwork and headlines. Words clear the moral ground. Law clears the legal ground. And then comes the physical act the moment the state's power becomes visible in bodies and broken doors. In Part 4, we reach the silent purge. The forced removals, the police presence, the demolitions, the leveling of homes, the disturbing of sacred spaces, the way an entire community can be wiped away not with a single dramatic explosion, but with a sustained campaign of pressure until leaving becomes the only option left. And then, almost insultingly, fast leisure arrives, carriage wheels rolling over what used to be someone's living room. There is a particular kind of violence that does not look violent in the official record. It doesn't leave a single iconic photograph. It doesn't produce one cinematic moment the nation replays for decades. It arrives in stages, letters, warnings, deadlines, then ends in the most ordinary cruelty imaginable. Strangers with authority walking into your home and telling you the home is no longer yours. The erasure of Seneca Village did not happen in one dramatic blast. It happened the way modern displacement often happens, as procedure. Picture the scene not as an abstract project, but as a neighborhood hearing its own end approaching. The first rumor moves like smoke. The city wants the land. And then the rumor hardens into fact. A new park, a grand plan, a public good. Then the public good becomes a private threat. Eminent domain notices, compensation offers that rarely match the life being uprooted, dates circled on calendars like quiet funerals. And through it all, the city speaks the language of progress, calm, official, sanitized, while the residents live the reality of loss. Frantic, humiliating, intimate. Because property is a cold word for what is being taken. Property sounds like commodity. It sounds like a number, but a home is not a number. A home is a map of rituals. A home is a corner where a child learned to read. A home is a wall that holds the faint stain of a family's history. When the state decides to acquire land, it treats a home as an object. When a family is forced to leave, they experience it as dismemberment. Now imagine the day the city's power stops being paper and becomes boots. Police presence, officials, men with tools, the neighborhood watching itself turn into a site. Doors that had once meant privacy now mean access for strangers. Windows that had once meant light now become eyes for onlookers. The soundscape changes. The mood changes. The village's future collapses into a narrow corridor. Pack, decide, abandon, disappear. And one of the cruelest elements of forced removal is how it punishes dignity. A family is not simply displaced, they are exposed. Their belongings become visible in the street, their vulnerability becomes public. Their private life becomes a spectacle for the city that has already decided they are blight. This is why smear campaigns are so effective. Once a community has been labeled, any image of struggle becomes proof that the label was correct. Forced poverty is then used to justify further punishment. It is a loop designed to make empathy feel unnecessary. As homes come down, A landscape of absence emerges, foundations exposed like bones, gardens destroyed, churches, institutions that do not merely occupy space but produce community dismantled, schools emptied, the architecture of belonging ripped apart and scattered, and here the story's cruelty becomes almost obscene. Even sacred ground can be treated as inconvenience. Cemeteries, graves, the quiet claim of memory disturbed or displaced because the city's plan requires a blank canvas. When a project demands total transformation, the past becomes debris. This is the climax because it is the point where Central Park's nature begins, not in green growth, but in obliteration. The park requires not only engineering, but erasure. It requires the land to forget. It requires the public to forget. It requires history to become invisible. And then comes the image that burns because of its contrast, the arrival of the spectacle. After the removals, after the leveling, after the land is cleared, the park begins to take shape. Paths appear, carriage drives are graded, lawns are smoothed. The natural world is arranged like scenery. And soon enough, the wealthy arrive to enjoy it. Elegant carriages roll through a space that has been transformed from lived community into leisure landscape. Fashion on display, leisure as performance. The city's elite, using the park as a salon without walls. It is hard to overstate the insult embedded in that transition. The same land that recently held the quiet dignity of black homeownership becomes the place where wealth performs itself. The park's purpose, at least for those who funded and celebrated it, was to create a cleaner, more beautiful, more civilized environment. But civilized, in that context, often meant white and wealthy. It meant the removal of people whose presence complicated the aesthetic of purity the city wanted to project. And then the final act of the purge, the disappearance from memory. Because destroying buildings is one thing. Destroying a story is more difficult, yet that is exactly what happened. Seneca Village did not merely vanish physically. It vanished culturally. It was omitted, ignored, allowed to sink beneath the newly imported soil like a voice smothered by a pillow. No prominent memorial, no sign, no official narrative that said, here is what we did. For more than a century, people visited the park without knowing they were walking across the footprint of an erased community. This is the part of the story that should make you uneasy, because it reveals how completely urban beauty can function as camouflage. A city can commit harm and then cover it with something so lovely that the harm becomes difficult to believe. The grass becomes a kind of denial. The trees become a kind of amnesia. The laughter of picnics becomes a soundtrack that drowns out the fact that the ground beneath was once someone else's life. And because the park is genuinely beautiful, the camouflage is almost perfect. You don't want to think about displacement while watching children play. You don't want to imagine foundations under your blanket. You don't want to hear the echo of police boots while you listen to birds. The park's brilliance is that it offers you emotional relief, and emotional relief, when it arrives at the right moment, can make moral questions feel like inconveniences. But the truth does not go away. It simply waits for someone to dig. In part 5, we come back to the present, back to the lawns, the playgrounds, the picnic spots, and we connect the park's illusion to its buried reality. We'll talk about what it means to sit on stolen ground, why the story of Seneca Village matters now, and how Central Park becomes a template. A beautiful public project that quietly teaches the city who belongs in the good spaces and who can be removed when the future requires a blank slate. If you want to feel how power truly operates in a city, don't look at its speeches. Look at its landscapes. Landscapes are where decisions become permanent. A policy can be reversed. A headline can be forgotten. But when you reshape land, when you bury foundations under imported soil and plant trees on top, you aren't just building something, you are rewriting what the next generations will assume is normal. That is why Central Park is so powerful, and why it is so dangerous as a myth. The park is not merely a place people visit. It is a story people inhale. It teaches New York, day after day, that the city can manufacture nature, manufacture peace, manufacture beauty, then call the result public good. And because the result is genuinely soothing, the story becomes persuasive. People accept the comfort and forget to ask the price. Now, bring your attention to the west side of the park, around where Seneca Village once stood, roughly between 82nd and 89th Streets. Today, you can find some of the park's loveliest stretches there. Lawns where blankets bloom in summer, play areas where children chase joy, paths where people talk softly as if they've stepped into a different city. Nothing about the scene suggests trauma. That is the haunting. The surface is innocence. The ground is history. Imagine spreading a picnic blanket without knowing you've placed it over the footprint of someone's living room. Imagine tossing a ball where a church once held hymns. Imagine a child's laughter rising from a playground built on top of a community that fought with remarkable courage to become stable, educated, and politically visible. This is not an accusation aimed at the park's visitors. It is a portrait of how erasure works. Erasure doesn't require you to be cruel. It requires you to be unaware. It requires the city to succeed in making the past feel irrelevant. And it succeeded for a long time. For more than a century, Seneca Village was treated like an embarrassment best left unmentioned. Not because it was shameful, but because it made the park's origin story complicated. Cities prefer clean myths. We built a great park for the people is clean. We took land from a free black community and buried their history under a masterpiece is not. So the clean myth won. Museums focused on the genius of design. Tour guides emphasized scenic vistas. Real estate brochures praised park views. The surrounding neighborhoods grew more prestigious, more expensive, more secure. And the park, as it raised property values and enhanced the city's image, became not just beloved, but untouchable. Criticism began to feel like sacrilege. This is why the Seneca Village story matters now. Not as a guilt trip, as a blueprint, because once you understand what happened there, you begin to recognize a pattern that repeats, sometimes openly, sometimes quietly in cities everywhere. Here is the pattern. A place is labeled blight. The people living there are reframed as obstacles to a better future. The public is told the removal is for the greater good. The land is taken, the community is scattered, and then something improved appears, something beautiful, functional, modern, profitable. Over time, the improved thing becomes the only thing people remember. The original community becomes rumor, then footnote, then silence. The new landscape becomes evidence that the decision was worth it. This is the oldest trick in urban morality. Let the outcome justify the means, then hide the means under the outcome. Central Park is often described as the city's great equalizer, a place where anyone can enjoy green space regardless of wealth. In the present tense, that is partly true. The park is open and millions use it. But in the historical tense, at the moment of its birth, it was not equalizing. It was sorting. It was reorganizing Manhattan's value system. It was teaching the city which spaces deserved investment and which people could be displaced when investment arrived. And the irony is brutal. A project that looks democratic can be created through profoundly undemocratic actions. A public paradise can be built through private suffering. A civic masterpiece can be constructed on top of someone else's stolen stability. Now, there's another layer of resonance that makes Central Park feel almost like a haunting. It is not supernatural. It is structural. When you bury a community, you don't only bury buildings, you bury the possibilities those buildings represented. Seneca Village was not just housing. It was a rare experiment in black self-determination on Manhattan land. It was black property ownership at a scale that mattered. It was voting rights rooted in land. It was churches and schools, institutions that create continuity across generations. To destroy Seneca Village was to destroy a potential lineage of stability, wealth building, and civic presence. That loss doesn't stay in the past. It echoes forward. So when we talk about the park as an early act of gentrification, we are not forcing a modern term onto an old story for shock value. We are identifying an early instance of a mechanism that continues to shape American cities, the transformation of space for the benefit of wealth with displacement as the hidden cost. Central Park is iconic, which is why it's such a useful case study. It shows the pattern in its most polished, most celebrated form, and that is why the park's illusion is so powerful, because it makes the pattern feel like virtue. You could argue correctly that Central Park has brought immense value to New York's life. Environmental relief, psychological refuge, cultural identity, civic pride. You could argue that the city needed green space. You could argue that the park is one of the great works of landscape design in history. All of that can be true. The question is not whether the park is valuable. The question is whether the value required the specific violence that produced it, and whether the city's willingness to erase Seneca Village reveals a moral hierarchy that still operates today. In other words, the park is not on trial as beauty. The city is on trial as power. And now the story comes to its most unsettling conclusion. The grass is not just grass. It is a cover, a soft, living cover over a hard lesson. When you walk through Central Park, you are walking through a masterpiece of design and through a masterpiece of forgetting. The same pathways that offer escape also demonstrate how thoroughly a city can rewrite itself, then persuade you that it has always been this way. In part 6, we close the circle. We'll hold the final paradox in our hands. Central Park as triumph and as theft, as democratic dream and as early urban crime. Then we'll pivot to the next New York object of obsession, an angular building that terrified the city's imagination, a structure people mocked as impossible, dangerous, doomed. A ship of stone rising at a strange intersection, a wedge that looked like it might catch the wind and fly. Central Park survives because it gives people something they desperately need, the sensation that the city can be forgiven, that concrete can be softened, that ambition can be tempered, that wealth and noise and haste can pause long enough for a child to chase a ball across an open lawn. The park is, in the present tense, a mercy. And that is precisely why its origin story is so easy to resist. We don't like to interrogate the things that soothe us. We don't like to discover fingerprints on our comfort. But if you want to understand New York, if you want to understand America's modern city-making, you have to learn to hold two truths at once, even when they grind against each other. Truth one, Central Park is a masterpiece. It is a triumph of landscape art and civil engineering. It is one of the most influential urban parks ever made, and it has offered real, measurable relief to millions of bodies and minds. It has become a shared room for a city that has too few shared rooms. In a metropolis built to extract energy from human beings, the park returns some of that energy back. It is beauty that functions. It is design that heals. Truth two, Central Park is an illusion, constructed, curated, manufactured, not nature preserved, but nature composed. A pastoral painting executed at city scale, rocks blasted into shape, swamps drained and disguised, hills graded, soil imported, trees planted to look accidental, lakes designed to feel discovered. The park's greatest trick is that it hides its own scaffolding so thoroughly you stop seeing it as a project at all. You see it as inevitability, as if the island always meant to become this. And the third truth, the one that turns the episode into an indictment, sits beneath the first two like a buried foundation. The park required displacement. Not an unfortunate side detail, but an essential condition. Before the lung could breathe, something else had to be silenced. Before the city could claim this beauty as for everyone, it decided certain people did not get to stay on the land. The most haunting name in that decision is Seneca Village, a community of free Black New Yorkers and other marginalized residents, many of them landowners, building institutions, stability, and a rare form of political belonging. Their homes were not simply removed. Their story was covered. Their place was not just taken, it was rewritten. This is why Central Park is often the perfect case study for the oldest moral sleight of hand in urban history. Convert power into beauty, then use beauty to excuse power. A city can do something brutal and then cover the brutality with something so beloved that questioning it feels like vandalism. The park becomes its own defense attorney. Every picnic becomes a vote of confidence. Every wedding photo becomes a new layer of myth. Every peaceful afternoon becomes another reason the city doesn't have to remember what it did to make peace possible in that particular place. So what does this mean for the viewer, for the modern walker, for the person sitting on the grass right now? It does not mean you must hate the park. It means you must see it without the blindfold of romance. It means you must recognize the park not only as green space, but as civic evidence. Evidence that public good can be real and still be built through injustice. Evidence that a project can serve millions and still begin with erasure. Evidence that the language of progress, cleaning, improving, beautifying, can be used to justify removal when the removed are politically weak, racially marginalized, or simply inconvenient to the vision of the powerful. Central Park, in that sense, is not merely about the past. It is a blueprint for the present, because the same logic repeats in new costumes. Redevelopment, revitalization, rezoning, up-and-coming neighborhoods, the transformation of undesirable space into desirable space, and the quiet disappearance of the people who were already there. The term gentrification is modern. The mechanism is old. Central Park shows you that America's earliest great projects often carried a hidden message. The city will build beauty where it wants, and if you are standing in the wrong place, your life becomes movable. And this is the final paradox we leave you with. Central Park is both a gift and a confession. A gift of relief, a confession of priorities. It shows what New York can do when it wants greatness, and it shows what New York is willing to do when greatness demands space. So the next time you walk through the park, when you pass an open lawn that looks like innocent leisure, try to imagine the invisible layer beneath it. Try to hear, under the bird song, the older noise. Wagons, blasting, demolition, displacement, the quiet panic of families being told their lives are now in the way. Not to ruin the park, but to restore what the park's illusion stole. The truth that this beauty has a cost, and the cost had names. And now we pivot because New York's history is full of objects the city tried to laugh away before it learned to worship them. If Central Park was a paradise manufactured through force, the next story is about a building the city feared would be destroyed by nature's simplest weapon, wind. They called it impossible. They called it absurd. They watched it rise at a strange intersection, like a wedge cutting into the sky. And they made bets not about how beautiful it would become, but about when it would fall. Some swore the first big gust would rip it apart. Others said it would topple like a mast. The city treated it like a dare made of stone and steel.